All right, this is Ricky,
And this is Brendan.
and you're listening to A Gentleman's Disagreement.
What I wouldn't give for the hope I used to find in a case of lion's head. Folks of different minds, because even though it did not share the pains we share, that American ideal, friends made over arguments in an early morning buzz. Need an early morning buzz.
All right, Brendan, it is Friday, May the 26th. Very special pod for the guys, or as I am now talking to Brendan Kelly, JD. Want to do a little shout out.
There you go.
Congratulations to our esteemed co-host, who is, as of last week, a Juris Doctor. We are very, very proud here at A Gentleman's Disagreement. How does it feel in the law school?
Well, I appreciate it. It's funny, Ricky. It's always when you have these milestones, it's a time of reflection. And it's funny thinking about like reflecting on the podcast in context of my law school career. As we started this when I was heading into law school almost 3 years ago now, and I remember being like, I don't know if this is the right time to start this. I've heard law school is pretty challenging, but look at us. We've gotten this far, and I got the JD down, and we're still going, which is not necessarily what I would have anticipated. So it's been a good run for me personally, and for us together.
Yeah, well, I mean, credit to you. The timing was not impeccable, I will say. But you had soldiered through. And actually, I should note for the people that he is a dual degree recipient of a Master of Public Administration as well from Suffolk University. So now he's got all the degrees. So
yeah, Ricky had me outgunned on graduate degrees for a minute. Yeah.
Yeah, then he went and got two, and now he's one up on me. But enough about us. We have, I think, something very special for the folks this weekend to lead you right into Memorial Day. So why don't you tell them who we're talking to?
Yeah, well, first of all, happy Memorial Day to everyone out there. Hope that everyone has a great weekend, but a particular shout out to the veterans who listen, the veterans in all of our lives. You know, the people that have. It's obviously a weekend time for remembering a lot of fallen soldiers who have given like the last full measure for our country and the things that we believe in. And one of those things that we believe in is freedom of expression, and that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today. We are incredibly lucky this week. We're joined by Dr. Bertha Madras, who is a professor at Harvard University. We'll give her a fuller bio when she comes on, but she came to our attention because last month she, along with another doctor at Harvard, Dr. Steven Pinker, penned an article in the Boston Globe about a new venture that they were starting at Harvard, which was the Council on Academic Freedom. We'll obviously discuss this in far greater depth when Dr. Madras joins us, but an overview of the council is that it's devoted to, quote, free inquiry, intellectual diversity, and civil discourse. And they have faculty from all of the Harvard schools, from all across the gender, racial, ideological perspectives. And so they're coming together with the goal of ensuring that academic freedom continues to thrive at Harvard and hopefully at other campuses and institutions of higher learning across the country. So it's super excited for the conversation. It's definitely a critical one, and it feels almost appropriate on Memorial Day, where you have all of these people that have sacrificed so much to allow people like me and us to have these freedoms, that we're going to have a conversation, while not in the context of war, in the context of like, we need to also work to ensure that everything that people have gone before us that have done for us, that we're continuing to ensure that those freedoms still exist for us and for the future in our country.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this one.
We're going to bring Dr. Madras on shortly, but before we do, a quick reminder to everybody, the podcast is brought to you by the hardworking craftsmen over at Cannon Hill Woodworking. They've been building handcrafted high-end custom tables and desks in Boston since 2018. That's Cannon with two N's. You can check them out on Instagram or visit them online at www.cannonhillwood.com. You know, Ricky, it seems like the seasons are changing. It feels like summer is in the air, and maybe you want to go out and change some of the wood furnishings in your house just to spruce things up.
Oh, knock that one in there. I like it.
There we go. All right. Without further ado. All right, we are now thrilled to welcome Dr. Bertha Madras to the program. Dr. Madras is a professor of psychobiology at the Harvard Medical School, where she directs the Laboratory of Addiction. She also directs the Laboratory of Addiction Neurobiology at McLean Hospital. That laboratory focused on translational research, neurobiology of therapeutic and addictive substances, brain imaging, and medications development. Her current research focuses on the behavioral and molecular consequences of drugs introduced to adolescent primates and whether these responses differ in adults. She is the recipient of 19 US and 27 international patents with collaborators, so no big deal. But then transitioning into education, Dr. Madras developed the first addictions course for Harvard Medical School students, and she created the cell biology of addiction course at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. In public policy, Dr. Madras served as a deputy director for demand reduction at the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, which is an presidential appointment where she was confirmed unanimously by the U.S. Senate. In 2017, she was appointed by President Trump to a 6-member commission on combating drug addiction and opioid crisis. She's the recipient of the National Institute of Health Merit Award, the National Institute of Drug Abuse Public Service Award, the American Academy of Addiction Psychiatry Founders Award, and others. In 2006, the Better World Report cited her brain imaging invention as one of 25 technology transfer innovations that changed the world. So, Dr. Madras, thank you. That's just a very brief bio, but thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to discuss this. I must say this is the first interview that I've had that I've agreed to on the Council of Academic Freedom. And the reason I have shunned away from it is because I am not an expert on academic freedom. I've been sheltered all my life away in a lab, speaking to scientists about neurobiology. And so I feel a little bit undereducated in this topic, but I'll do my best.
We're not worried about you being undereducated here. But so again, the reason why we have Dr. Madras on is to discuss the Council of Academic Freedom, which she helped create over at Harvard recently. And Ricky and I were talking, Dr. Madras, one of the things I think stood out to both of us was exactly what you just said, is that you're a doctor. And so why did you feel it was necessary, as someone that works really in the medical school and, as you just said, like in labs for most of your time, to be at the forefront of creating this council?
I think it's because it can affect every one of us in every single discipline in a university, including in medicine. For example, and I know that I will ruffle feathers, but some of the medical journals now, in fact, some of the very highly cited and high quality ones, are compelling people to use persons who are pregnant instead of pregnant women in terms of language regulation. It does affect all of us. It affects every single discipline. In fact, on the council, there are 15 people within the Faculty of Medicine. There are, and that includes surgery as well as medicine. There are 12 biologists. There are 4 people in computer science. 5 people in engineering. So even though the topic may seem within the domain of law, political science, ethics, philosophy, there are a number of people who are extremely interested in this, that because they're concerned for the future, not only of our culture, but also for science itself.
I think that's a really interesting point, particularly on the policing of language. But, to kind of bring it back to your specific field, which has in many ways, scientific truths, things that are factually accurate and not. I'm wondering how in that, from the sort of scientific perspective, how you think about speakers who may bring forth information that is not really true in terms of how either they're connecting dots, and how you think about that.
It's a very important question, and one has to think about how settled science is in general. There are certain branches of science, such as mathematics and physics, in which the variables can be regulated very tightly, in which the accuracy is so exquisite that one can say that the Earth revolves around the sun 365 days a year and almost never be questioned on that statement of fact. There are many other areas of science that are not that cut and dry. And there are many areas of science in which the science is never settled, because every single layer of the onion you peel, there are other layers and layers and layers. There are many dogmas that I learned about when I started as a graduate student that are risible at this point because they no longer hold. So we can't think of science as quantal. Science is truth and accuracy, and all the other disciplines are fuzzy and open-ended. Science also has many, many areas in which one can dispute and debate, not necessarily the data, but how to interpret it.
So just jumping off that, one of the things that stood out in the article written by Professor Pinker and yourself is this line that says, quote, "The only way that our species has managed to learn and progress is by a process of conjecture and refutation. Some people venture ideas, others probe whether they are sound, and in the long run, better ideas prevail." Close quote. And I think that goes to what you were just saying, where this idea of, whether it was in higher education or politics or just in democracy, for a long time, it seemed like the marketplace of ideas prevailed. That seems less and less the case, really, on both sides in recent years. Any thoughts on why that idea has seemingly fallen out of fashion?
I think one of the reasons it's falling out of fashion, but I don't think it's irreversible. I certainly think it's reversible, is, first of all, we have to recognize that these debates on freedom of speech are not new. They're ancient. In 1600, the poet John Donne made a plea for freedom of speech. That was, 400 years ago. John Stuart Mill debated the concept of free speech and why it is so critical to have it. In our country, we had many periods and episodes where free speech was not really, even though it was protected in the First Amendment in terms of what the federal government can do, it still was not protected in terms of what words you could use, if you could use expletives in the media and so on and so forth. So it's not as if we are just recognizing that we are in a downward slide in terms of this debate. This debate is an unending, open-ended debate that has resurfaced a number of times, both in world history and in the history of the United States.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Ricky and I talk a lot about pendulums where things swing one way and then they swing back hard the other way, and then people kind of course correct. And I think Ricky will probably want to follow up on that at some point. But I got another question here, another line from the article where this, again, goes with what you were saying, where the article says, quote, "To start with, the very concept of freedom of expression is anything but intuitively obvious," which is one of those really interesting lines because, Dr. Madras, as you alluded to, we always think of freedom of speech. That's a core tenet of being an American. But at the same time, the article goes on to say what is intuitively obvious is that the people who disagree with us are spreading dangerous falsehoods and must be silenced for the greater good. And that seems way more core to just people of being protective against the Darwinian, protect yourself against things that you think are different or dangerous.
Yes. I mean, John Stuart Mill, he quoted, "But everyone has his or her own notions of what speech is dangerous or worthless or plain wrong and undeserving of protection." And, Nate Hentoff said he wrote a book called Free Speech for Me, but not for thee.
Yeah.
So what we have seen over the ages is that very often people who want free speech for themselves and will not, and certainly will not suppress free speech that agrees with their own particular views, will in fact try to suppress the speech of others in which they disagree. And I think that's basically what's happening now. It's an activist movement. It does not seem to represent the majority view. It is by far the majority of the vocals who are trying to impose this on society. In academia, the job of administrators and deans and presidents is try to keep a campus calm and not exacerbate passions and try to reduce the hype. And so I think that in some ways, what I call the uncourageous administrators have caved because, for the sake of trying to maintain some decorum on campus, they've caved to the activists and just they've de-escalated by allowing the most vocal people to have their say and not listening to the majority.
I think that's something that we talk about a lot. I mean, particularly in politics, sort of the loudest voices in the room being the ones that get heard, but everyone else seeming to try and keep their heads down and not get yelled at.
Yeah.
This survey, which was just published in the Crimson, said that 76% of surveyed faculty say they believe academic freedom is under threat in America. Only 11% disagreed. Now, that says something extremely important. That's why we have 126 people who joined the council. And the vast majority of them, are endowed chairs, which means they are the elite of the elite. 91 have endowed chairs, and only a handful of people who are unprotected, which means they don't have tenure, they're not full professors. Only a handful have joined, and there would be a lot more if they didn't live in fear.
Sure.
Yeah. I want to get back to sort of the idea of the responsibilities of the institutions, Harvard, any other university in this case. Obviously, the preservation of academic freedom here being, I think, paramount. But on the other side, I think there can be a recognition that college students are impressionable. So, what is kind of the responsibility of the university, if on the one hand to allow and to protect the rights of students to bring voices that they want to hear, but to have those voices potentially not be one-sided? Like, how does the university kind of navigate that?
Well, I think the university has to show much greater resolve in terms of protecting ideas that are not fashionable. We have to recognize that everything that we do now in our culture will be considered obsolete, perhaps 50, 100 years from now. Many things that young people believe or faculty believe now may not stand the test of time. And in order for it to be examined, to be weighed, to be debated, to understand the value and relevance of certain ideas, we have to have the voices that are contrary to what is the conventional wisdom now, in terms of the majority conventional wisdom. And the administration has to have the backbone, the spine to uphold these values, because if they don't, the most vocal people, the squeaky wheels, will get and suppress a free exchange of ideas, and that is completely contrary to what the mission of a university is. What worries me the most is in this survey that was published in the Crimson just yesterday, is that 57% of the faculty respondents agree that Harvard should give controversial speakers a platform, even when faculty or students object to their views. So the majority said yes. But why isn't that 100%? And the reason it isn't 100% is that the other 43%, 20% disagreed, more than 20%, is that the others actually do not accept the idea that there are ways of interpreting and viewing the world that are contrary to their own beliefs. That is frightening.
Yeah.
Or perhaps they were worried that these speakers could be disruptive. But that too is a surmountable problem. Because if there are no consequences to disruption, the disruption will continue. If there are consequences to disruption, the disruptions will be far fewer and far less verbal and activist.
Yeah, Dr. Madras, I'm sure you're aware that there was a big incident at Stanford Law School back in March.
Yes.
And the dean over at Stanford Law School, Jennifer Martinez, came out with this letter. She apologized to the judge that was invited, that was heckled and shouted down and not allowed to speak at Stanford. And she apologized and then wrote really, in my opinion, a very impressive letter to the Stanford community explaining exactly why she felt it was necessary to have speakers like this on campus. And the conclusion of the letter says, quote, "Thus, I believe that the strong protection for freedom of speech is a bedrock principle that ultimately supports diversity, equity, inclusion, and that we must do everything in our power to ensure that it endures." And so I thought that this is kind of a great example of exactly what you're talking about the administration. I would bet that she does not agree with the judge and some of his views that were coming, but she's going to stand up for his right to come and speak.
Absolutely. The death of the president of the University of Chicago, President Zimmer, was also eulogized recently because he issued a letter, a statement on this is a university that's going to uphold the principles of free speech. And we are not going to be subjected to concerns about being triggered or being hurt by words. And apparently his letters distributed to incoming classes every year. And I think that is the kind of resolve, that is the kind of backbone and the kind of courage that I really would love to see in every single president of every academic institution in our nation. Our nation really is the forefront of freedom of speech. It is freer than almost every other nation in terms of press, in terms of individual liberties. And we have to maintain that because the alternatives, the suppression of speech, the suppression of ideas, gives rise to totalitarian states.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah, seconded. That also reminds me of Cornell recently was their student body sort of passed a resolution that said we're asking or requiring that all professors provide trigger warnings and allow students to sort of opt out of content that they might find objectionable. I don't want to misquote, but I believe it was the president of the university there came back and said we can't accept this because of how it's going to impede the ability for professors to teach the content that they want to teach. So I think this kind of reminds me, not reminds me, but I guess evokes two questions. One, do you feel like we've reached an inflection point and now the tide may be turning where professors, institutions, school, boards and bodies are less afraid now to stick up for academic freedom, even if it means bringing to the fore voices that we don't, that we're not interested in?
Well, I can speak only for our institution, and that is I am thrilled that the Council of Academic Freedom launched. And after we were about 40 odd people after the letter was published in the Boston Globe, we've had an additional 76 people or 86 people join. And as I said, most of these are endowed chairs, which means they are the elite of the university in terms of faculty. I think it is critical for this movement to continue. I think there are signs that there is a growing dissatisfaction with what these threats, which have been coming from the left and right, to academic freedom. And I do think that it is absolutely a sign that there are some universities where the backbone is surfacing. Harvard, I hope, is a driver for this because there's a great deal of thoughtfulness that's being given in terms of what the mission statement is of the council, what issues we're going to engage in, and also, and this is really critical, is data. Getting accurate data on what's happening is very important because a lot of the information that is being touted in the press may or may not give us the full picture. And it's really important. One of the things that I recommended to the council is gathering data on why people want to suppress the speech of others. The fact that they are triggered, the fact that they're uncomfortable is obviously how they will answer it, or the fact that they do not accept the premises of another individual. But I think it is important to excavate deeper into that issue of why they don't want to hear somebody that opposes them. It's as if they don't want to hear an opposition to almost a quasi-religious belief, rather than an opposition to a scholarly idea, a scholarly set of data, a scholarly set of conclusions.
That's really interesting. I want to stick with Harvard actually for a minute because in some ways, and Dr. Pinker alluded to this in the article, that Harvard is one of one, where you would kind of think that academic freedom is in some ways like least threatened at Harvard because professors all across the spectrum are always going to want to teach there. Students all across the spectrum are always going to want to go there. And so obviously you and Professor Pinker work at Harvard, but why else do you think it was important to have the academic council at Harvard?
I think it's really important because if you actually look at the breakdown of faculty, 32% say they're very liberal, 45% identifies liberal, 20% is moderate. Just a little over 2% are conservative, and less than 1% are very conservative. Now, when you have a breakdown like that, any ideas that are contrary to either mainstream or extreme liberal ideas are going to be considered outside the boundaries of scholarly thoughts. I think that I'm very concerned by this breakdown, frankly, because half the country is conservative, the other half is liberal, and the conservatives make as much of an important case as to why they are as the liberals do, and yet the faculty does not represent the spectrum of ideas that are current in modern American society.
Wow, that's surprising to me, and I want to follow up on that. But so as I mentioned to you, Dr. Madras, I just graduated from Suffolk Law School last week. We had a panel with Nadine Strawson, who was the former head of the ACLU, the first female head of the ACLU last year. And one of the things that she was saying, and we also had a professor at Suffolk, and she was saying that she's been saying the same things for 40 years. It's at first when she was doing this in the 80s, she was fighting people on the right, and now she's doing it in the 2020s. She's fighting people on the left. Like the professor that joined the panel, he's an Asian American, a liberal professor, and he said when I was there in the 80s, it was not all, but overwhelmingly white males who are conservative, and he was like, man, we really need to diversify our faculty. He's like, now I look around, unless you are a minority minority, a woman, a liberal, you have no shot of getting hired these days. And he's like, I feel like I'm saying, and now he was getting criticized by all the old white guys in the 80s, and I was getting criticized from like the diverse, the left, and in the 2020s. He's like, I haven't changed in 40 years. And so I'd be curious from your perspective, you've been at Harvard, I believe, 37 years. Like, how have you seen a similar type change?
Well, I've seen certainly a similar change in terms of trying to diversify both the faculty and the students. And if Harvard considers itself as a global player in scholarly research and academia, it is important to recognize that there are people from all over the world that merit a post within the community. To actively exclude white males, to me, is a travesty. To almost make that a non-entry level criteria. Because what I would love to see above all is merit. Literally to choose people on the basis of merit. And obviously there are meritorious people from all over Asia, from Africa, from South America, from every part of the world. But if merit is the criteria, that should be the number one criteria. And from my perspective, affirmative action has certainly given opportunities to people who would not have had them in the past. I think it has done a very important contribution, but I think in terms of faculty, in terms of grants, scientific grants, I think in terms of publication of papers, it should be blinded in terms of what a person looks like and based on the quality of their work.
Yeah, I mean, again, couldn't agree more. Last question for you is, there's one line in the...
I have one last anecdote. I must say, I was subject to what I would call censorship when I was a student at McGill. I was a very young undergraduate at McGill, and when I heard of the riots in Soweto, Southwest, Soweto in South Africa, in 1960, so I'm 100 years old, so that dates me. I was an editor, women's editor, sports editor of the McGill Daily, so I knew how to exercise my free speech, and I decided to hold a rally on campus in protest against the crackdown on the rioters, and also in support of these rioters in apartheid South Africa. I organized a rally. I ordered a megaphone. I put in a large ad in the McGill Daily so that people would congregate on the steps of Redpath Hall. And the next morning, I woke up energized with all the facts and information, and every single poster was down. I was refused the megaphone, and my big article, which I had sent to press at 11 o'clock the night before, was just a blank white sheet, a blank white piece of the newspaper. I was censored for upholding the rights of people to express themselves in apartheid South Africa. And I'll never forget that moment in my life, because I was probably 16 years old at the time, and nobody ever urged me to do this. It was just spontaneous after reading an article on it. And then I realized a lifelong of a lesson, how important it is to allow people to express themselves.
Yeah, sorry that happened to you, but like really cool that 60 years later, you're still crusading for the exact same ideals. Yeah.
Well, and of course, I found out later why all this happened. There was a lot of investment in South Africa.
Well, nobody
wanted to rock the investment boat.
Well, the more things change, the more they stay the same. I know you have to run, but one final question for you. There's a line in the article that says, quote, "If we don't defend academic freedom, we should not be surprised when politicians try to do it for us, or a disgusted cynicity writes us off." Both of those things are happening, but I want to focus on the former, where clearly in Florida with under Governor DeSantis, but we've seen it across the country. I believe that there are 34 current bills in 20 states. It's already been passed in Florida and North Dakota. It's being considered in Oklahoma and Texas. And when you see that, this is where, Ricky, we talk about the pendulum swinging too hard the other way, where this is, even though these people are quote unquote like trying to protect free speech, they're swinging it so hard the other way that now they're limiting the speech of the other side. And so, Dr. Madras, if you just want to touch on that, of why you feel like now is really important for people like you and the council to do the work that you're doing.
It is critical because having worked in Washington, I am too familiar with politics, I think, in terms of that level. And we must not let politicians interfere with academia. I think there are things in public schools in K to 12 that could be considered problematic in terms of curriculum. And from that point of view, I think it's really important to look at the accuracy, the greater social good of what's being done. I think there is room for tremendous improvement in curriculum and in K to 12. But once we get into higher education, I think it is so important for academia not to become a venue for politicians, as it became in totalitarian states. Sure. In the Nazi regime, in the communist system, in China, in Russia, in Cuba, everywhere politicians have interfered with academia in terms of in terms of expression, in terms of exploration. The Lysenko the sordid story in Russia still has reverberations today and cost millions of lives because politicians decided to favor one scientist who was essentially a crackpot over truth. So we have to guard this freedom on both sides of the spectrum, on all sides of the spectrum, for now and into the future.
Well, that's a beautiful way to end. Dr. Madras, this was phenomenal. Thank you. I said to Ricky, even before you came on, I was like, I think if we could talk about this stuff and talk to you for hours, but thank you so much for your time. Like, we greatly appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.
Bye.
This is it. Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
That was all on our end. That was awesome.
Wow, that was really incredible. I like, as she was speaking, even in the brief moments that we've had after she signed off, there's just so much to unpack there. I think in just hearing, obviously first, incredibly eloquent in terms of just how off the cuff she was able to put some of this stuff together. It was it was sort of a masterclass to watch and appreciate. But it also got me thinking, of course, as these conversations tend to. And there were a couple of things, so I'll throw them out at you, and you let me know where you want to start. I think one thing that was sort of the subtext of a lot of what she was saying is this idea that we are out here censoring and canceling people, but really the question is, like, shouldn't we be trying to divorce the actual people from the ideas? And then we should, if we disagree with an idea or a premise, we should be attacking, like, that should be the focus. Yep. What is the content and how do we agree and or disagree with it? And she asked this question, like, why are we, we have to ask ourselves why we want to censor certain people. And the sort of the easy answer as well, the things that they say trigger us or they make us uncomfortable. But I think she was really trying to allude at, but what is okay, but then, but then what? Why is that a good enough reason to sort of silence that entirely? And I think there's a little bit of the idea of, because we're afraid of the appeal of this, we don't believe in it, but we can see how other people would believe in it. And so we're scared to let that be out there, whether it's, controversial issues on gender identities or on, any sort of political views or, what have you. I think there's this idea that we are afraid that people will be convinced of things that we believe to be untrue. But that is the very essence of academic freedom. That is exactly what you guys were talking about with the marketplace of ideas, of these sort of like, we allow that to exist in that space, and then the cream will rise to the top.
No, stop. I want to hop in there. Great. It's a great point. And I think that's really true of the fear of allowing other ideas that disagree with you. And we talked about that, and from like the Darwinian perspective, is that we think that we believe in free speech, but free speech is a little bit scary, and it feels a little bit dangerous when people are out there saying things that we don't agree with and other people seem to agree with. And so our natural instinct is to try to silence it. And you have to actively work to overcome that. And I think that's what she's saying, is that because we have such a small group of people that are actively working against that idea, it does take people, the silent majority, whatever you want to call it, to stand up and be like, no, we have to stand up to this. And Ricky, I just reached over my desk. One of my debate students gave me this last year, and it says, everything is debatable. And like, I really believe that. And some things could be wrong. Like, you could take a wildly wrong position that we know is just like really not correct, but then prove me wrong, right? Don't just dismiss me, shout me down. And it says it in the article. They say that people today are quick to label others as dangerous. You label them as racist, sexist, transphobic, which the article says we rightly, as a society, abhor those things. But when someone just doesn't agree with you, and then you're like, well, you're a racist, like you're a transphobe, and it's like, well, can we talk about it? And if you're so right, then prove me wrong. And I think that's so many people these days, and we always talk like this rise of like safe spaces, and it's been parodied in so many places, but it all comes in a basis of reality of people not wanting to engage in ideas and think that like, if you're so right, then prove that you're right.
Yeah. And this idea that we can actually protect people by limiting the information that they take in, right? Like, we've talked about kind of the idea of, what is the purpose of an education, of a school, higher education? Like, obviously there are specific things that you need to learn, but beyond that, it's way more how to learn.
Yep, 100%.
And how to critically think than what to think.
Yep.
So the notion that we can like support institutions that say that, no, you have to think this way, is completely antithetical to how we think about the university system. And I thought you asked a great question around like, why Harvard? And I obviously I knew there was going to be a liberal bent. I did not know that conservatives to very conservative made up less than 5% of the faculty. And to me, obviously, I'm a huge proponent of diversity. I really believe in its benefits, but it's got to go beyond, right, race and socioeconomic status. This idea of diversity of thought is probably the most important thing for universities, because that's what you're so incredibly pointed to, like things that we believe that were dogmas taught to us as like unequivocal truths. Today we would say, oh, that's actually ridiculous. That doesn't make any sense. But the only way is that somebody was allowed to explore. Okay, I don't think that this is true, but let me figure it out. Let me test this. And that is so important. And I think maybe like something like this coming out of a Harvard, and obviously it's got to permeate, but I'm hopeful that people will realize that we do ourselves more harm than good, even if that means we have to listen to things that we find objectionable or abhorrent. Whatever it is, the best way to combat that is to present the ideas, to like hear them out, and then one by one dissect the claims and whatever, refute them.
Yeah, you said so many interesting things there. One, to touch on like affirmative action for a minute. Well, I think one of the main goals of affirmative action was diversity of thought, actually, in being like when we expose people to people of different genders, of different races, of different ethnicities, of different sexualities, you have a broader perspective of ideas and life experiences that now it broadens everyone's worldview, and you come into contact with different ideas. And I feel like, as you were kind of saying, it's been boiled down to race in a lot of cases, where it's like, actually, we just want to allow people with like different perspectives, so because that enables us all to get better. Also, yeah, the Harvard stuff was shocking to me, and one of the things they did mention in the article was that out of like the free speech rankings that apparently people conduct every year, Harvard is 170th in the country out of like 203 colleges, where I was surprised by that. And then I guess last thing, you said so many good things. I forget. I should be writing down when you say too. But one thing I will say is that you brought this up, where there's a fine line here between legitimate academic debate and ideas and like hate speech. And even though I do think like hate speech can be debatable, and you can bring people to campus who you can clearly prove are coming from a place of anger and hate, there's a line, and I think there is some responsibility, and I think the problem is when we label everyone as a racist or a transphobe or sexist, right? Then those terms have no meaning, because for the few people out there that are really those things. So I do think there is a line to be drawn. My problem is just when you draw that line so broadly that you label everyone a racist, a homophobe, a transphobe, a sexist, right? And then it's like that word no longer has any meaning. And the few people out there that truly have those hateful beliefs are now, they're just lumped in with a lot of people that have like legitimate ideas and disagreements with some of these, so-called like sacred cows, which is another thing I want to get back into that she said that I found fascinating. But last response to what you said, where education is about teaching people how to think, I could not agree more. I think one of the problems that conservatives have had in recent years is they feel that academia, from K to 12 through higher ed, has been teaching people what to think. Quite honestly, given like the breakdowns in faculty that Dr. Madras just gave at Harvard, it's hard to argue that that's probably true. But what the problem is the answer to that apparently is now we're going to teach you what to think. It's just going to be the opposite of what the other people are teaching. You know what I mean? And it's like, that's so frustrating to me, where like, and again, if people aren't familiar, like DeSantis is now pretty much creating these colleges in Florida that he's like stacking. It was like only conservative faculty, and you can't teach about DEI, and you can't teach about like racial history, and which I know maybe I'm exaggerating slightly, but it's not. He's basically teaching people, he's saying like what you can and cannot teach, which is the exact same thing that the left has been doing for so long. And that's why I think what Dr. Madras is doing, and what I hope spreads to other campuses, it's got to be the people in the buildings, in the institutions, that are saying, they're like, no, this is not right. This is not what we're here for.
Yeah, totally. I think just building on that a little bit, the idea that she said, like, why does Harvard need to do this? Because in this moment, a lot of the policing is coming from the left, censoring people who are, espousing more conservative beliefs. So it is incumbent upon sort of, the voice that, or the body that's in power at that time to kind of come forth and say, hey, this is dangerous, because even though we may agree that we don't like some of the ideas that are being censored, and we may prefer that people not have to hear them because of the history. And you guys did a great job of sort of seeing the pendulum swings over the years. And obviously, right, like the more conservative bent towards like any kind of, quote unquote conspiracy theories in the 60s and 70s were all coming from the left. Now they come from the right. So this idea that like where we are today is where we're going to be in 50 years. And she, again, just like such a phenomenal job, just kind of like pointing that out. Like we are constantly reconsidering things that we thought were unequivocal truths. And we are finding that they are not so much. And we are, as a society, like continuing to evolve. And I thought that was so cool and well said. And it just like reminds me of, I want to say Socrates, something that we learned like very early in our days in RL, which was like his like whole thing was like, the only thing that I know is that like I know nothing. Like in the grand scheme of things, all of this knowledge that I can acquire in my lifetime is so infinitesimal in comparison to like the expanse of the universe that like it behooves me to just not be the person who's rejecting ideas. Right? Like I should be constantly taking in ideas and considering them and exploring them and figuring out, does they make sense? Do they not? Do I need to learn more? Do I need to understand more? And I think in so many ways we are doing that now. We're like looking into structural racism. We're like looking into things that we hadn't looked at before. But at the same time, we cannot be shunning those ideas that are questioning our questioning.
Well said. And the Socrates example is great. And what's the Socratic method is just asking questions to try to learn more and try to understand better. So two final things that I wanted to touch on. One is that when she was digging into, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, of why people are uncomfortable, why people are quote triggered, she said that it was almost like a religious belief. And I think this is another argument that a lot of conservatives have made, is that as religion, like traditional organized religion, has fallen in the United States in recent years, decades, what has replaced it is this rise of like this kind of civil religion of like the only sin is intolerance. And that's taken over everything. And I was like, when she said that, I was like, that makes a lot of sense. Is like the way a lot of people would react traditionally to like people attacking God or their conception of what their God or gods are. That's where like I'm not even going to entertain that conversation, because this is so central to my faith, my being. Like this is who I am, and that I think has taken hold a little bit on the left, which makes sense. Where it's like that same, I'm not going to even entertain conversations that I feel are so central to who I am.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was a bit dramatic in the letter when it referenced like the Inquisition, but there is a degree to that, right? Like, and it goes back to why can I not hear ideas that upset me or that I disagree with? Like, I should be able to hear them ad nauseum and know 100% like what is true what is true and what is not, right? Like the problem is if we try and solve it by saying, no, just don't listen to it, that is really how you get the Donald Trumps who are saying, this is the silent majority that I speak for. These are the kids that are afraid to talk on college campuses. The guys who work in the office place that are afraid to express their views. Well, the best treatment for that, the antidote, is to like, yeah, go ahead, say whatever crazy thing you want to say, but let's dig into it. Let's figure out if it makes any sense. Like, let's figure out if after we kind of examine all like the totality of the facts that argument or whatever still stands up for you. And I think rather than trying to say that you need to go preach, listen to the YouTube videos in your closet, it's like, yes, there are things. Yeah. Right. Like how are we ever going to convince you otherwise? Just telling you that you're wrong, just telling you need to be quiet is not doing it.
And I think that's where the article starts off by saying that college and higher education has like suffered the greatest decline in public opinion in recent years, which is shocking given like how low people think of like Congress or the Supreme Court right now. And like college is lower than that. But I think that's what a lot of it is people feeling like you have these people in their traditional ivory towers that are saying that you are wrong and that like we are right and you are wrong. And I think that's a legitimate reason why people have been turned off by higher education. Final thing that I thought was important was the way she spoke so passionately about why this is so important, about how like we need to actively be fighting for freedom of speech because it is the cornerstone of our democracy. And I think you and I can see this all over the place, what happens when we lose free speech in our democracy. And not only here in our country, but as she was saying, it's, you know, like that classic city on a hill metaphor of like, this is where freedom of speech is the most free in all of the world. And if we don't protect it, who will? And I thought, again, like you might think like, oh, that seems dramatic, but listening to her, I was like, this is really critically important. And so that was the final takeaway I had, or like the overall takeaway I had of listening, of getting to hear from her today.
Yeah. The line at the end of the article that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty in so many ways is poignant and perfectly said. That like no matter how far we come, like if we cannot rest on our laurels for any of it. And yeah, so at the same time is that it's like a little bit kind of discouraging, but it's also so hopeful that like we can, as long as we at least adhere to this principle, this idea that academic freedom is what is going to lead us forward, not any specific set of ideas. And that's really something that we can cling to, I feel like.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's well said. This was an absolute treat. Thank you so much to Dr. Madras for joining us today. We continue to feel incredibly grateful to be joined by people like her. Thank you to everyone that listens. As always, if you like what you heard today, obviously you can listen to us anywhere you get podcasts, Apple, Spotify. You can also follow us on Instagram at _gentlemen's_disagreement. We really appreciate it. If you have any feedback, as always, feel free to reach out. But this is one of those days where I feel lucky that we get to do this, because this was just super interesting, super fun.
Indeed. Till next time.
What I wouldn't give for the hope I used to find in a case of lion's head. Folks of different minds, because even though it did not share the pain as we share, that American ideal, friends made over arguments in an early morning buzz. Need an early morning buzz.